Thank you, Jaren. I'm delighted to be here. I wish when you picked the islands, you picked another one rather than the Spratleys. I'm not sure I want to be torn apart quite so early in the morning. When Li Minjiang asked me to talk about the subject of the rise of China, the future of Asia, I thought, my goodness, what a big subject. How can I possibly do that? And had I been wiser, I should have said no. Find me something easier. I wasn't wise enough, so I accepted. But since then, I've seen the program, and I see that in the program, the subject is going to be looked at and discussed in a range of different ways, and the coverage is pretty good, pretty comprehensive. So that makes my task a little easier. At least I think I can find a different focus to talk about this very difficult subject. I thought the one word that was missing in the program was something that is much on everybody's mind, is just the globalization of the world. And in that globalization, we talk about regions, but at the same time, we talk about the global. And what do these regions mean? China is one, Asia is another, and global suggests that we are looking at the world as a whole. So I thought I might just go back a little and look at words like Asia and China, and what do we mean by them? What is Asia, for example? We take it for granted that we know what Asia is, but of course a lot of people around who know that that's a problem. We don't know what Asia is, and we are often confused ourselves when we describe something as Asian or something that is peculiar to Asia. Indeed, when I was then led to think about it a little, about Asia in the new globalized world that we are looking at today, I was very struck by the fact how late the idea or the concept of the word Asia described the area that we're talking about today. Indeed, it was not, I think, as late as the 19th century, if not the 20th century, that most atlases in the world describe Asia the way it is today. And that in the language of the various political leaders, the thinkers, the philosophers, and so on, prior to that, we have very different terminologies. I mean, we have words like, for example, the Middle East, whatever that meant, and we still use it. Or the East India Company, so that the East India is another term. And by East India, it's really a wide coverage. And then, even more interesting is the way the British invented the term the Far East. And that again covered a wide area. And if you look at the literature in the 19th century, they were largely talking about the Middle East, India, meaning East India, and East India included Southeast Asia, incidentally, but the Dutch used that too, for the East India Company and the Dutch East Indies. Incidentally, that confuses everybody, because there's also the West Indies. So don't ask me to go back that far. But you can see the terminology is far from precise. And so where did Asia come in? And I was very struck looking at the material again, that it really was in the 20th century that people talked about Asia more regularly, as if it was one place. And that itself raises a lot of questions. But what is Asia? I think, in fact, there is, if you look at the whole of history, there was an area that we could talk about. Again, the name is new, but the conception of it, I think, was very ancient. And that is, human history really began and did most of its development, including most of its struggles, its fighting, its killings, its murders, its civilization, its rise to greatness, in an area which we call now, broadly, Eurasia. It's a massive area covering all the land areas of what we call Europe and Asia today, but also including North Africa. And that has been the source of most of human history on record anyway, for the last 4, 5, 5,000, 6,000 years. We can talk of this area as being interrelated in one way or another, mostly by war and deadly struggles between various powers, but also by remarkable progress in economics, in political, in institutions, in ideas, and so on. This Eurasia, of course, has no boundaries, but essentially a landmass. And this landmass extended in many directions. It's very hard to locate a center for it, but if we wanted to pinpoint it to a center, it's broadly in Central Asia. People have talked about it before, so I'm not inventing this. In that Central Asia area, then we can recognize that there was a center in Eurasia, but of course, it was also a center where there were outlying areas. And these outliers were Western Europe, China, and India. These are the most remarkable outliers because they were remarkable in that they each created and established their own civilization, which from time to time were faced with great invasions and threats from the Central Asian heartland, from Eurasian heartland, and they resisted those threats and managed to preserve themselves either politically or culturally. They managed to sustain through many, many centuries something that remained distinguishable from what was in that heartland. But they were continually threatened by the forces coming out of that heartland. And we can identify some of them. You can date back from the days when, right from the ancient times, the kind of attacks on the ancient empires of Egypt or Babylonia. They came out of Central Asian heartland, and there were others. But the interesting thing about this Eurasian concept is that there was a heartland, but in the outliers were very continental too. China as an outlier was a continental force. India as a heartland was also a continental force, which both of these places had their own civilizations and as I said, successfully resisted being overwhelmed by the forces from Central Asia. But the Western European one was particularly interesting because there the outlier wasn't only continental, but it had a sea, the Mediterranean Sea. Neither of the other two major heartland areas, outlier areas that I talked about, had that kind of relationship with the sea. They were facing oceans. In the case of China, what we call the Pacific Ocean today, India was the Indian Ocean, but these were massive oceans in which the coastal areas were limited, and civilization did not depend on any kind of mastery of the sea. Whereas the Western Europe, I call it that as a shorthand, had a sea. And right at the beginning of its history, it was always continually faced the problem of fighting at sea. And you can date this from the way back to the Phoenicians, the Greeks, to the Romans, the Egyptians, the Persians, all at one point or the other had to deal with the question of how to win at sea, how to battle at sea. And if you look at even in terms of the civilization, the history of it all, you have the great heroic epics, which is the Iliad and the Odyssey from the Western civilization angle. These heroic epics deal with the sea, both of them, particularly the Odyssey. Now, there's no such thing, to my knowledge, there's no such heroic tradition, maritime sea tradition in the literatures of those two other outliers, whether it was India or China. But this one had. And that feature, the maritime aspects of political and cultural and economic development of the Western European scene was, I think, a significant difference from the rest. And I don't think it is an accident of history that this Mediterranean aspect of the European experience was so important for the future of this globalization process that we talk about. because it was that experience, that division of the Mediterranean. Because as long as it was a dynamic area in which people contested, disputed it, but also moved back and forward, it was a very lively area. It was a source of great civilization. But at one point, about 1,500 years ago, the outburst from the Arabian desert of Islam changed the pattern, surprisingly, once and for all, for it lasted 1,500 years. And that is that it led to a division of the Mediterranean in a way unknown before that. Before that, it was sort of back and forth. But thereafter, the division remained. As you know, the Islamic force went right into Europe itself, across the Atlantic to the Iberian Peninsula, and on the other end, eventually, following various moves, following the beat back of the Christian Crusades, eventually overcame the Eastern Orthodox Church and established the Ottoman Empire, right again back to the gates of Vienna. Continually refer to that. But of course, there was a history behind that. If you go further back, it was again the Eurasian forces. We're coming back to it now. When the European history talks about it, Chinese history talks about it, Indian history talks about it. And the outliers all had the same experience of forces coming out of the Eurasian heartland and threatening them. The Europeans talk about the Huns, the Chinese talk about the Xiongnu, later on we talk about the Turks, and the Turks moved in many directions towards China, towards the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, and in fact finally climaxing in the Mongols. And the Mongols of Genghis Khan, of course, represented the peak of Eurasian force against the outliers, and indeed succeeded in almost every direction except in Europe. And that was only because, as far as we can tell, because Genghis Khan died and the Mongol forces were pulled back to deal with the internal arrangements, political arrangements following his death. And that they stopped and they went back. But actually, they took most of the Middle East. They took China, they conquered China. So the two outliers were already threatened, and China was under their rule for 100 years. And their descendants, mixed up with the Turks, what we call the Moguls, took India, most of India anyway. And so you can see that the Eurasian forces moved in every direction, and they only stopped in Western Europe. The only part of the outlying area they didn't reach was the Western Europe, west of Vienna. But they reached the Mediterranean, they reached the Indian Ocean, they reached the Pacific Ocean. Now that was, as I said, the peak, the climax of it all. But of course there were residual forces, and I refer to the Ottoman Empire, when the Turks moved about as far as possible, again to the gates of Vienna, and we've been sorting out that one ever since, right through up to the 20th century, when we talk about the Balkans and so on. We're still talking about the residual problems of that particular outburst from the Eurasian heartland. Now, I mentioned all this history in order to say that what we talk about when we talk about Asia, we really got to sort ourselves quite clearly from that massive history, that's 4,000 or 5,000 years of history in the background, which we cannot afford to ignore. That is the nature of this Eurasian mass, of which we now say one part is Asia, another part is Africa, and bits of the others is North Africa. I think those geographical terms of today actually have misled us, or at least have led us to forget the roots of our human history right from the start. So I go back to it just to remind us of that, because in that context we come back to what has happened since then. Because what has happened since then, to me, could be put in these terms. When the Western Europeans were blocked off from the rest of Asia by Islamic conquest and the division of the Mediterranean, they were finally forced to turn to the sea, the other sea, the sea outside the Atlantic. And we know the story from there, the way the Portuguese sailed south to discover the Western African coast right down to the south and into the Indian Ocean, and Columbus went across the Atlantic, and that's a new story begins. But that is very late. And so it's not until about the 16th century that this really began to take root and influence European history after that. Up to that time, European history was very much focused on the Mediterranean and focused against all the forces coming out of Eurasia, defending themselves from the Eurasian forces and preserving their civilization by being successful in defending that civilization. But because of the break, the division in the Mediterranean, they knew there was a lot of wealth, a lot of civilizational features which they understood from travelers and so on, beyond the Islamic world, in the Indian area and about China. They were looking for enemies of the Muslims at that time. They were fighting a crusade. They were still continuing their crusade in many ways. But most of all, the discovery of another route to get to India and China was a major breakthrough. And that breakthrough was, I would like to put it in those terms, was a kind of breakthrough from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. And why I emphasize that is because it was a manifestation, a new manifestation of maritime power that was already perfected in the Mediterranean, but had led to a kind of stalemate between the forces within the Mediterranean. And to break that stalemate, they went outside of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic, and then from the Atlantic into the Indian and Pacific Ocean, all within a century. It was quite a remarkable story when you think about it. So that changed the world. And what that means is that what we mean by global is maritime. You cannot be global continentally. That's a simple fact. Of course, you can go on to say thereafter, from now onwards, it will also be airspace and cyberspace and other things. But I think the essence of global, at least the world as we see it, as we know it, is maritime. And maritime really comes from the Mediterranean political experience of struggle and division and continual conflict, which finally led to the stalemate. And I come back to that later. But this global then, this maritime replacement of the kind of continental forces coming out of Eurasia was a major shift in our human history. And it really took a long time. It started in the 16th century, becoming significant in the 17th and 18th century. By the 18th century, the maritime forces had been sorted out so that basically one particular power, British naval power, had become supreme. And it's in British naval power terms that you get this idea of global. That when they say the empire, the sun never sets on the empire, that is the first expression of this confident assertion of a globalization that one particular empire had achieved, but with a lot of competition from the French and others as they went along. But by the 19th century, this was secure for the British, for at least for most of the century, as the rivals began to pick up and industrialize in the same way that the British did, one after the other, following the British pattern of industrial capitalism, with the modernization of military forces, the tremendous advances in science and technology that militarized the world in completely new ways, but most of all, in the maritime power that could be expressed absolutely well beyond the imagination of any of those who fought in the Mediterranean, but now the projection of that kind of maritime power around the world that the British led, so it was also followed by the French, and ultimately by the Americans. But in the course of it, the other outliers, you remember I said there were three outliers. One was the Western European one, which included the sea, the others which were bordered on oceans but did not have the same kind of maritime concerns. Of course, we do know, and everybody refers to it today, the fact that the Chinese had a navy capable of crossing the ocean under the Ming Dynasty, and Admiral Zheng He and his 7 expeditions to Africa showed that the Chinese were masters for a short while of both the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. But of course, again, through to their continental history, the Chinese lost interest in that and just abandoned it and focused on the defense, once again, the defense against the forces from Central Asia, from Eurasia. Because, as you all know, whatever money they saved from all those expeditions, expensive expeditions in the Indian Ocean, they used all that to build the Great Wall. And what does that mean? And the Great Wall was precisely a recognition that the Eurasian forces were far more important to China than the sea, the ocean. What did it matter if you didn't have a navy? And what did it matter? Because there were no real enemies out there. There was no threat from the sea, so they abandoned the exercise altogether. What was left was just a little bit of coastal shipping to defend against pirates, smugglers, and other illegal activists in the area, but concentrated all their forces on defending their outlying civilization against the fantastically powerful Eurasian forces that had always threatened China from right at the beginning, right down to that time. Now, this is a reminder of how new it was an experience for China, and for that matter, India, to experience this maritime global that I say came about from the last few centuries, but that really became a global force in the 19th century. And only then that maritime power overcame Eurasian power. But when I say that, I have to be cautious, because even when I said that, and when I thought that, I was reminded of the fact that in many ways you can say the Cold War was a very interesting final example, maybe final example of this opposition of the Eurasian continental forces on one side and the maritime forces on the other. One led by the USSR, the Soviet Union, the other led by the United States and its allies on both sides. In many ways, that was Eurasia, especially when the Russians got the Chinese on side after 1949. Didn't last very long, but nevertheless, when they got together, you can see the shape of a massive Eurasian power that could threaten Western Europe on the one side, threaten China, and in fact absorb China into the Soviet orbit on the other, and then faced by the US-led maritime sources. And this comes out very clearly. One very simple example, if I may just use it as an illustration, and that is that, as you all know, the Chinese Communist Party conquered the whole of China, defeating the Kuomintang and others, entirely by land. It was a continental army. The PLA had no navy. They never needed one. They won all their wars on land. It was not until the very end, just before they crossed the Yangtze, that they thought of a navy. I have on many occasions drawn attention to this before, but let me emphasize, symbolically, what does that mean? It means that China, down to 1949, down to 1950s, 60s, and 70s, I would say, it was still essentially a continental power and thought in continental terms. And when they thought about having a navy, and they didn't have a ship, not even a ship, their first ships were those surrendered from the Kuomintang nationalist navy. A few ships went over, and that was it. And from then onwards, they tried to build a navy, but they never got very far. For a very simple reason. All the maritime powers were aligned with the United States. There was not a single maritime power that was aligned with this Eurasian force that was led by the Soviet Union. So the Chinese had nobody to turn, even to build their navy, except to Russia, to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union didn't have a great naval tradition, as we all know. It was not exactly known for being masters of the sea, the way the British, French, and today the Americans are. So that was the situation even down to, I would have to say, to 1990s, at the end of the Cold War. We were still talking about that. Except one small thing happened. That in the 1970s and 80s, China pulled out of that and turned to the United States for its own strategic reasons, turned to the United States. So that was a kind of interesting. China was an outlier to begin with, defending itself against the Eurasian forces. The combination of the Eurasian forces with China in the 1950s was a kind of aberration that had not really happened before. For the Chinese to unite to the Eurasian heartland forces against the maritime world had never happened before, but it happened for that short period, and the Chinese were so uncomfortable with it, and this Mao Zedong was, that he pulled away from it and turned to the United States for help in that context. I mention that because today, when we talk about the Chinese building a navy and so on, we must put it in the right context. What Chinese navy? How modern, how recent it all is. What naval tradition did the Chinese have that they've forgotten for 500 years or so? So we've got to put all this into context to know what we're talking about. And so let me come to the present. As I know we're running out of time, I'll come to the present as soon as I can now. When we talk about China's rise today, we have to bear in mind that all this talk about China's rise has always been in the context of the United States perspective of China. Of course, its neighbors are very conscious of this rise of this great big power, but there's not much others can do about it, but the United States can. And so this context of US and China has become a major topic almost everywhere that you can see. And when you talk about that, then it's what is interesting, particularly interesting, is that the United States and China have one thing in common. They are both continental and maritime powers. Well, China is not yet, but I think China would like to be a little bit more of a maritime power. But China was primarily a continental power. The United States is a continental power as well. That's the exceptional part. Why it is so superior to what the British left behind was that the British wasn't a continental power. The limits of Britain's tremendous achievements, but the limits was the fact that in the end it was a purely maritime power. It had no real capacity to deal with continental struggles. The Americans had. But the Americans have one big difference with China. This continental power that America represents is a very safe continental power. It really has no enemies on the continent. I hate to say this about the Canadians or the Mexicans, but I hate to say this, but they're no threat to the United States, and they're not likely to be threats to the United States. So the Americans are very safe. What a wonderful thing to be, to be a continental power that was really safe. But China, as a continental power, can never be safe. China is a vulnerable continental power. It has been vulnerable for thousands of years, and I don't doubt it will stop being vulnerable. It will always be vulnerable. So China has always got to be continental and try to be maritime at the same time. But their being maritime is, in a way, constrained by the continental vulnerabilities. And you can see even the way since Deng Xiaoping's reforms of China, China has never forgotten its continental relationships, whether it's the Shanghai conference or the fact that Mr. Xi Jinping is going to Russia as his first stop. All these are just reminders of the fact that the Chinese are constantly conscious of their continental vulnerability, and that is not going to go away. It will remain. So for China, as an outlier for this Eurasian continent, it will always be continentally alert and conscious of the threats, possible and potential threats from the continent. It doesn't have to come from the Russians. It could be from various dissident groups among the Islamic countries in combination with problems like Afghanistan and Pakistan and elsewhere in the Central Asian area. There are great uncertainties. It even includes areas which are part of China itself, like Xinjiang and Tibet, all part of this Eurasian continental vulnerability that the Chinese have lived with for thousands of years. The Americans have a fantastic advantage. Continental without threat, maritime power is supremely powerful, maritime, with the Chinese sputtering away with a navy which everybody speaks with great alarm, but frankly, that is just alarmist and has no basis whatsoever, if you know the history. But let me now try to come back to the future of Asia. How do we talk about Asia today? Asia now faces a completely new experience for Asia. Because there's a maritime world outside, and this continental world remains. That's where the history began. And Asia now has to deal with one power, which is maritime power is supreme, another which has vulnerable continental borders and a very weak and just emerging maritime forces. And China and Asia is looking at that today, paying a lot of attention to that. But there is more to it than that. Of course, a maritime power that is far away, like the United States, needs to get nearer if they want to keep the Chinese at bay, so to speak. And of course, this is happening. You can see that happening because the maritime powers now include a whole range of islands. They're talking about islands, except if you pick the one that I'm not so comfortable with. But you have all these islands, and these islands are beautiful chains in the maritime link-up, the maritime connection. And the Chinese can do nothing about them because they are a continental power. Their concerns are with the China coast. Their concerns are with the fact that they are now part of this global world. They are dependent on the global economy as they have never been before. Again, something new. They're adjusting to that, and as far as you can see, adjusting extremely well to it. But they're not adjusting to it in military terms or in political terms. They're adjusting to it so far, essentially in economic terms. Economic dependence on the market economy of the world, dependence on the resources spread all around the world, developing one of the largest merchant marines. In fact, I think it is the largest merchant marine force in the world that the Chinese have, because they're dependent on it. They depend on their ships. Yes, the ships to bring all the resources to China, and depend on all those merchant marines out there, merchant forces out there, to help to sustain the economic development of China. And that is, the Chinese are in that position. So in that sense, they are globalized. They are part of the global system, and they are dependent on the global system. But it remains continental. So it is only partially maritime, weak, and dependent on the permissible acts for China in the maritime world. And that maritime world is clearly American. And the way the American ships can roam around the world, and I'm not talking of marines, merchant marines, I'm talking about military ships. The naval forces of America can roam around the world freely, is something that is unimaginable for the Chinese. Or if they tried that, it would be extremely dangerous for everybody anyway. So that's something that has to be thought through. I don't know how the Chinese are going to deal with it in the future, but you can see the powerful naval forces of the United States, which are almost taken for granted. When I say that, I mean that everybody takes that to be the norm. Nobody is particularly concerned, that I know of, that the American battleships and aircraft carriers roam in all our seas. We take that as the norm. It is not the norm to think of it in Chinese military or naval force getting anywhere near, anywhere. Immediately, alarm bells ring and people get very concerned because that's not the norm. It's very unusual, very exceptional. Why are the Chinese doing that? That becomes the first question. Whereas what the United States do at sea, what it does at sea, is absolutely the norm. No questions asked. Perfectly normal, perfectly good. In fact, represent a kind of beneficent force that will ensure peace in the world. This is how it is. It is seen by most people, most analysts that I've spoken to. So that is the reality in which Asia is being placed. A China that is struggling to find its place between the continent and the sea, and a maritime power that is supreme and absolutely confident of dealing with anything at sea. So it is in that context that Asia is making its adjustments. I can go on to talk about what ASEAN, India, Australia, Japan, what these other areas think about its position in all this. But of course, they are not just Asia. They are just really peripheral to it. They're even outliers of Asia. We talk of Asia as the continental mass, as the heart of Asia. Here we're talking about the edges. And the edges, of course, the edges of the islands very clearly belong to the maritime world. The cases that are on the mainland, like India, Indochina Peninsula, including Myanmar and Thailand, or even Malay Peninsula on the mainland, then maybe a slightly different story. But they are so interlocked into this maritime world that there's still, as it were, room for maneuver for both sides. And I won't go into that. But simply to say that a kind of maritime arc which links up Japan right across to the Indian Ocean, including maritime parts of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN, and including Australia and New Zealand and so on, that would seem very normal to the norm that we recognize as maritime, the maritime part of the world. If I'm correct to say that global will be for a long time to come mainly maritime, then this maritime advantage that is already there will stay for a long, long time. And there is no way China on its own can in any way influence or change that dominance. And that's on the assumption that I say, if global is maritime, then that it would be the real situation. And the Chinese have to live with that. So whatever we say about China's rise is a dependent rise. It is not an autonomous, independent rise. It is dependent on this maritime world. If not for the maritime world, China could not have developed the way they developed in the last 30 years. That is the reality. So that dependent rise with an independent maritime force off its coast, of its coastline, is a reality. And finally, the final reality is that where does Eurasian heartland come in the future of Asia? I think we should not forget that is the Eurasian heartland. It has been more or less irrelevant for trading purposes since the end of the Silk Route, as it were. And for the last few centuries, we don't talk much about economic relations within that heartland. But we've never forgotten the political power still residual in that Eurasian heartland. Because precisely when we talked about the Cold War, when we talk about the disintegration of the Soviet Union, when we talk about Central Asia and the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan and the problems of Persia and so on, we are reminded of the fact that the Eurasian heartland is still very much in play. It hasn't gone away. The trade routes may have gone, but the political force that is represented by the Eurasian heartland hasn't gone. And it comes out in the struggle between India and Pakistan, the future of Afghanistan after the Americans eventually leave, the question of the borders between China and India, and China and the various stans of Central Asia, and the Soviet Union that touches on Xinjiang and Tibet. All these are still in play. And for the Chinese government, they can never forget that. This is as important to them, if not more important to them, for their own integrity as a country than the questions at sea. We, of course, in Southeast Asia, being especially on this island, we have maritime. We think maritime, and we think that's the most important thing. We look at the maritime power balance between the United States and China. We look at that, which is not a balance, it's totally imbalanced. But we forget, and I think we forget at our peril, that the Chinese remains a continental power with tremendous reasons, great reasons for being concerned for their vulnerable continental part. And of course, a reminder, their continental borders are 3 times as long as the coastal borders of China. Something that you all know from the maps. So I end by simply saying this. What we are up against and what we look at, see, is China being in a very unbalanced position. Tremendous threats remaining to continental disturbances which can affect the Chinese borders, and then faced with a kind of maritime containment. This is not the containment of the old time, not an ideological containment, that's not no longer really important, but a maritime containment in the sense that they will never have full say in what they say along the coast of China. Anything out of the coast of China, they are really dependent on a maritime power system that will always be able to contain whatever the Chinese does. That is the reality. So China is in a state of unbalance, and it has to work extremely hard in the years to come, to find a balance in which they could feel secure, equally secure, continentally as well as maritime. On the other side, there is a question of imbalance of a different kind. The imbalance of tremendous American power in the maritime area. But as we all expect the United States to remain a benevolent power, with not wanting to threaten anybody, then the question of how you use that maritime power to maintain a balance so that you don't get the Chinese to be too nervous or too concerned about their future, like being assured that at the other end, the maritime arc is merely a balancing side, not a containment, not an aggressive containment, not any attempt to really keep the Chinese down as they fear, which I think some of them do, not for that purpose, but simply to maintain a balance, to ensure that the relationship between the United States and China will always remain peaceful and always positive for the developments of all the areas in between those two nations. But bear in mind, and here's my last word on the subject, and that is only part of the global issue. It is not global. Asia is not global. Maritime is global. Maritime in every direction. But Asia is not global. Asia is only part of the story. And when we look at the story about Asia's future, we must always bear in mind that it's only part of the story, not the full story.